Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. Good timing. So I'll just, kind of the overarching question behind a lot of my research is how do linkages between ecological and social processes shape agro-ecosystem dynamics in response to disturbance? And I employ and synthesize quite a suite of different methods in my research. So as we'll talk about in a little bit, I've coupled large-scale data sets from FAO and USDA with observational and then even manipulative kind of experimental work in the field to capture both the broad patterns as well as the underlying mechanisms. And coupled all of that with farmer interviews, really to ground the research in farmer experiences, perceptions, understanding, and priorities. And so qualitative and quantitative analyses of some social data, and then theoretical modeling to help generate, to advance kind of innovative frameworks and approaches in the socio-ecological space. A lot of my work is community engaged and farmer facing, and so very intentional about dissemination among the farming community that I'm working with. So I've done things like presented at farmer-facing workshops in Spanish and English, developed this interactive story map about some of my dissertation work to share with the farmers, and working on developing a radio segment in Puerto Rico. So different kind of tailoring different dissemination approaches. So having kind of established some of the broader context and motivation of my work, I'm going to share some of the concrete ways that I've explored these themes and applied these tools around these intrinsic yield fluctuations. So we know that farmers, and particularly small-scale farmers and under-resourced farmers, are really highly vulnerable to various sources of variability. Consistent income is a key building block for resilience capacity, right? So the capacity to deal with, to withstand and recover from change. And so there's what might come to mind kind of more saliently is this climatic variability and extreme events. I've pictured here a banana plantation after the Hurricane Fiona in Puerto Rico. But there's another source of inherent variability in a lot of these long-lived or perennial plants known as alternate bearing. And it's these fluctuating years between high-yielding years that are followed by these low-yielding years. And it's received relatively little attention to other sources of variability on farms. Here, what I've displayed is, there's year on the x-axis in production. This is from a coffee cooperative on the y-axis. And you can see that, a high year tends to be followed by a low year. And if we think about kind of spectrum of reproductive variability in these long-lived plants, towards one extreme, there's things like figs that are really pretty consistent over time, as you can see in my doodle. Towards the other end of the spectrum are things like mast seeding species, so maple, beeches, oaks, many. It's a common phenomenon in a lot of temperate forest taxa, but essentially the population will have these synchronous boom years of seed output, really high seed output, followed by several bust years of little to no reproduction. And so this alternate bearing in crops is somewhere in the middle. It's been pretty well documented at the individual plant level for lots of different crops, but the kind of extent of synchrony and drivers of synchrony among plants is unresolved. And so early on, I was interested in whether ecological theories of mast seeding in forest trees could help explain alternate bearing in crops. Sorry, my computer's a little slow on the clicking. So in one study, we analyzed 27 crops known to be alternate bearing at the level of an individual plant. And we took data from the Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO, 57 years of national production data, yield data, it was standardized, so it's production per unit area. And we asked whether there were signals of alternate bearing in national scale production, which would be indicative or evidence of widespread synchrony. So if we're detecting these signals even in national scale data, it suggests that at smaller spatial scales, alternate bearing is also occurring. And so we calculated the lag1 autocorrelation. So a negative autocorrelation is what you would detect if one high year tends to be followed by a low year. as well as the coefficient of variation in detrended these time series. And I'm not going to go into this in detail. I just want to kind of set the stage with it. And so what we found was that, yes, alternate bearing does often persist at a national scale, right, which we can see across various crops here. And it exhibits patterns similar to mass seeding too. And so we're seeing this crop level phenomenon occur in a spatial scale that is similar to these forest natural systems, and patterns within crops that are also similar, in that it's more pronounced in wind-pollinated crops than insect-pollinated crops. And so it gave us initial evidence that alternate bearing is exhibiting these synchrony and patterns similar to mass seeding. And it contrasts with this widespread assumption that management in farms would outweigh the drivers of synchrony, right? And it kind of offered support for harnessing ecological theory that's been developed for mass seeding to deepen our understanding of crop alternate bearing, which has received, much less attention. And while variability is hypothesized and theorized to offer fitness benefits, so enhanced survival and reproduction in natural systems, in an agricultural setting, it can result in income fluctuations for the farmers and introduce kind of instability into the supply chains. So it's a really interesting phenomenon to think about how these social processes and ecological processes are interacting. So I dove into this more, and particularly using coffee as a study system. Coffee is a really socioeconomically important crop around the world. It also has interesting environmental implications, right? And that it's often grown in biodiverse areas of the tropics. And so it's interesting from both a social and ecological dimension. And it's known to be alternate bearing, but very little has been done on alternate bearing in coffee. And so some of the knowledge gaps that I was interested in addressing and that I'll touch on today, we're getting at some of the underlying mechanisms of this intrinsic or of these yield fluctuations in coffee, looking at the farmer experiences and the role of alternate bearing in decision-making, if any, right, and resilient strategies that farmers are employing. And then increasingly with a shifting climate, we need to think about how these processes are interacting with drivers of extrinsic variability or environmental variability, and starting to tease apart some of the patterns and drivers of synchrony among plants. So a region where I've done some of this work is in Santa Maria de Dota in Costa Rica. It's in Taresu, kind of just south of San Jose. It's the top coffee producing region of Costa Rica. It's a really coffee-centric community. And so while in some of the lower elevation regions, there might be shifting away from coffee towards other pressures like condo, right? Needing to build condos and or switching to more warmer climate crops with increasing environmental stressors. In Santa Maria, it's really important that we make kind of coffee continue to work in that if you're not a coffee farmer, you're doing something that's supporting the coffee farmers, right? You're a dentist to coffee farmers. So there's kind of few livelihood alternatives. It's tucked away in the mountains, and it's also within this highly biodiverse cloud forest reserve. So some of the questions that I was keen to address are, can ecological theory offer a mechanistic understanding of alternate bearing? Right? We've seen that some of the patterns are similar, but when we get at the mechanisms or the underlying drivers, we can improve our predictive yield models. It allows us to develop informed hypotheses about how different management practices or disturbances might shape these patterns. It's really key to identifying opportunities to secure more consistent yield. Though all of my work has been done with really stellar research assistants, and so I'll picture them throughout. Now, specifically, I was wondering whether this theory, known as the resource budget hypothesis, might help us explain some of the underlying plant-level mechanisms of alternate bearing in crops. So the resource budget hypothesis was developed to describe mass seeding, and it posits that these population-wide masting events stem from trade-offs in resource allocation at the individual plant level. rather than some external fluctuation in the environment, like resource availability or weather, right? And so instead, it's about these intrinsic resource trade-offs, and that individuals can then become synchronized through other forces. And it's received some widespread, though not universal, support in masting systems, but it's had pretty limited application so far in alternate bearing crops, and thought it might offer some insight into the mechanisms in coffee. So kind of the underlying premise of the resource budget hypothesis is that a high fruit load depletes resources and limits subsequent fruiting. So I'll kind of walk through that a little more. So let's suppose that there's this hypothetical pool of resources in a plant, and there's this threshold of resources necessary for reproduction. The theory posits that, okay, you accumulate resources, right, whether non-structural carbohydrates or nitrogen, past a threshold. When you do, then the plant will flower and depletes a little bit of resources, but then it's committed to filling those flowers into fruit, and that will really drain the resource pool. And so if it takes a year to recover those, that's how you would result in an alternate bearing pattern. If it takes more than a year, then you would get massed seeding. So that's kind of what the theory posits. And thinking about it in coffee, so as coffee is developing these fruits in a given year, right, it's also extending these branches for the subsequent years, reproduction, so that'll house most of the fruiting nodes in the following year. And it's also developing these newer branches that are not yet reproductive, these more apical or vertical stems that will be reproductive the following year. So it's kind of a convenient plant for looking at these resource trade-offs between years. And so the hypothesis, right, is that the more fruits in one year, the fewer there will be the following year, given these resource costs. And so I developed a manipulative experiment to test these premises. So does a high fruit load limit subsequent fruiting? To get at this first question, we took across 3 farms. We had 120 plants that were in a control treatment, so no fruit load manipulation. In another subset, we removed the fruits from 1 out of every 3 reproductive nodes. And then in another subset, another treatment, we removed 2 out of every 3 reproductive nodes. So we had 100% relative fruit load, 66%, and 33%. We did this at the pinhead stage of the fruit, it's called, so when they're really tiny, and therefore prior to substantial resource investment in filling the fruit. And then we tested the effect of this relative fruit load on fruiting effort the following year. And we looked at both these older branches, so the ones that were reproductive when we imposed this manipulation, as well as the newly reproductive branches that weren't fruit bearing when we imposed the manipulation, but that were when we measured it the following year. And also we looked at 2 scales, the number of fruited nodes, as well as the number of fruits per node, to get kind of a finer scale understanding of, okay, if these trade-offs are taking place, kind of at what scale, at what sites, right? And so here on the x-axis, we have the fruit load treatments from lower fruit load to higher. And this is looking at, now the following year, do we see that those that had the lower fruit load now in the following year have higher fruit loads, right? And so precisely as hypothesized. So it offered some support, therefore, for these resource trade-offs. And when we looked in the newly reproductive branches, we found a similar pattern, right? Slightly less pronounced, but still apparent. So yes, a high fruit load did limit subsequent fruiting. And so then we turn to the second question, right? So do we see that a high fruit load can actually measure the resource depletion? And so we focused on nitrogen, which is really important to seed development, and it's often limited in the tropics. The model resource budget hypothesis was actually framed around carbohydrates, but we thought that nitrogen might be more limiting in this system. And so we did a follow-up experiment where we again had that 100% fruit load and then a 33%, so just the kind of 2 more extreme fruit load treatments. And we harvested the stem tissue and as well as leaves, but I'll show the stem data because it was the same. And we measured their nitrogen concentration at different points throughout the growing season. And so in the same year of the manipulation, in those that had less fruit, we found that they had greater resource stores or greater nitrogen concentration at the end of the season. And those that had more fruit had substantially less nitrogen left, right? And then in the following year, we would expect this pattern to switch, right, in terms of the fruit load treatments. Oh, sorry, I realize I'm not using my cursor effectively. In terms of the fruit load treatments, but still be the same in that those that have more fruit, right, deplete more resources, and those with less fruit have more resources at the end of the season. And so this data offer pretty strong support that the resource budget hypothesis can advance a mechanistic understanding of these intrinsic fluctuations in perennial crop yields. So having advanced or established that there are these kind of broad patterns in national scale production, and we've gotten at, okay, what are the underlying plant level drivers? And then from there, curious about what are farmers thinking about in terms of how are they understanding this source of intrinsic variability? How do they manage it? And how do they cope with these low years in alternate bearing cycles? And given the potential impact on farmer livelihoods and their broader resilience capacity to deal with other kind of unexpected or extrinsic disturbance. Right, so we've established national scale synchrony and some plant level resource dynamics as an underlying driver. And when synchronized across a farm, it would have direct implications for farming livelihoods. And we know that consistent yield is really important for farmer livelihood and well-being. And so I'm going to talk a little bit, this study got at these feedbacks between farmer decision-making and farm level alternate bearing. I'm going to focus really on the red side of this today, but I'll just mention that, so in the interest of time, but it was part of a larger study that also involved quantifying signals of farm scale alternate bearing. And the short and sweet of it is that, yes, we observed alternate bearing in farm scale production data, but we didn't find kind of compelling explanatory predictors. So the degree of alternate bearing wasn't related to differences in input intensities or how much they were fertilizing or even pruning practices. There was kind of a slight relationship with farm elevation where yields were less variable at higher elevation. I'm happy to talk about that more later. But really, I think the more interesting is the farmer testimonies and experiences of it. And so we did this coded analysis of semi-structured interviews structured around this conceptual model. We worked with 29 farmers, the same farmers that we did this farm scale analysis with. And we were curious about relationships between some of the more human dimensions in blue and more of the environmental dimensions in green, and then the focal fluctuations, these synchronous farm scale alternate bearing. Quantifying environmental disturbance was kind of outside the scope of this experiment and study, but figured it could play an important role, so we included it. And so I'll just walk through this model a little bit and highlight a couple key points from this analysis. So when we asked about the drivers of alternate bearing, farmers had pretty varied perspectives, but excitingly, several explicitly pointed to these intrinsic resource trade-offs, which they articulated in different words, saying things like plant is tired, right, or exhausted after a high fruit year and needs to recover, or it's just the way coffee is. And also pointed to poor management, which again is indicative of an intrinsic driver, right? So it's a result of not effectively managing it away. And the perceived drivers also was associated with the strategies that they reported for managing alternate bearing. So those that identified these more intrinsic drivers tended to point to pruning and or replacement, so kind of rejuvenalization of the farm as effective strategy, right, to get around these resource trade-offs, or fertilizer, right, which again targets plants' nutritional status and vigor. Another common reported cause was weather or difference, kind of variability in the climate, which is consistent with ecological theory. Again, there's something called the environmental veto hypothesis that suggests that basically an environmental disturbance that disrupts reproduction would synchronize plants, because if you impede the ones that were going to have a high year and the ones that were going to have a low year have one anyway, then they'll become synchronized. And so it's consistent with that theory. It's kind of unclear from this data whether farmers are pointing to the weather as a direct driver of the variability, so that kind of reproduction matches whatever weather conditions, or if it was an indirect kind of synchronizing factor of intrinsic variability. That'd be something to dive into a little bit more. But again, patterns in terms of the strategies identified by this group of farmers tended to be more around pest and disease management. So weather potentially kind of paving the way for some of these pests and diseases to take hold. They also were more likely to identify shade as a management strategy, presumably given the buffering effects against extreme heat and precipitation extremes. So coffee can be sun-grown or shade-grown for context, though I'm sure that is not news to this audience. And then in terms of coping with low years, really folks kind of unanimously pointed to maintaining management, so in terms of agrochemicals and labor, essentially at all costs to avoid a downward spiral, just even in low yielding years. But there were interesting patterns here as well. And so some of the farmers were more diversified farmers, so they either had other crops that they were growing and marketing, or a pizza shop or some other source of income. And this group was more likely to point to drawing from these supplemental income sources to cover the costs of farm management during these low years. Whereas coffee specialists, or those that were more reliant on coffee for their income, pointed to making sacrifices at home. So kind of tightening the belt, and making sacrifices in terms of like not going out to eat and not putting off repairs, etc. Or taking out loans from the coffee cooperative. And then only those that were kind of hobby farmers or that weren't making much profit. I think two folks pointed to limiting management, and some people said nothing, right, to deal with these low yielding years. But most folks that were relying on coffee had some coping strategy to deal with these low years that did not involve kind of reflecting management to like limiting management to reflect the low yielding year. And one farmer articulated it as, when there are bad harvests, it's difficult to maintain a living. I make the sacrifice of doing the same management on the farm. So from this study, we found that farm alternate bearing often persists, right, despite these efforts to manage it. Farmers possess this detailed knowledge, even of these like invisible resource dynamics. And it impacts livelihoods and decision-making. And some of the coping strategies may be kind of maladaptive in the long term, in the sense that variable climate and market conditions mean that there's really no guarantee that you'll get a return on investment if you're taking out loans, or that conditions will improve. So if you're making sacrifices at home, right? And so efforts to support farmers might focus more on strategies to support livelihood diversification, or achieving plant health and vigor, trying to mitigate some of these resource trade-offs with fewer agrochemical inputs. Costa Rica, where I was doing my work, is a really agrochemically intensive country, but there might be some options in promoting nitrogen fixing trees and more regenerative soil practices. And so I wanted to get at, kind of dive deeper into how alternate bearing might impact farmer resilience capacity more broadly, or their ability to withstand and recover from an extrinsic disturbance, or an environmental disturbance. And it's really been thus far excluded and ignored in the context of socio-ecological resilience. And I think it's kind of, it's kind of an injustice in that there's this assumption that farmers, even among farmers, that they should be able to manage away these fluctuations. But more and more the data suggests that that's hard to do or not being done. And so what other ways might we take alternate bearing into account to better support resilience, right? And so to do this, I parameterized the resource budget model. So that resource budget hypothesis I talked about earlier is it's an equation, a model. And I used it to model how these intrinsic yield fluctuations might interact with an extrinsic disturbance, like a drought, a pest outbreak, or anything that interrupts reproduction at a large scale. And so I'm just going to walk right through it. So the important thing to know is that the model predicts that reproduction, if the stored resources are below this threshold of reproduction, then reproduction will essentially be zero. If the resources surpass the threshold, then reproduction will be proportional to the cost of reproduction multiplied by the resources that are available for reproduction. And so we're interested in how we can use this model to introduce kind of variation. And so first I just had these two plants, right, orange and purple here, and they're both alternate bearing, but they're out of sync with each other, right? They're asynchronously alternate bearing. And from the perspective of a farmer, this might actually be okay if alternate bearing only occurs at a plant level, because you get kind of an average yield. But what happens if we introduce a disturbance that disrupts the reproduction and was in what was a projected high year for the purple plant? Now it's forced low. And what you see over time is that they become synchronous with each other. And so now in this simplified kind of illustration, farmer income would also be going up and down. Right, so initially it has this kind of, what's that called, a bumper crop, but over time the resource dynamics align. This is what I was describing briefly earlier as the environmental veto hypothesis, right? That in a disruption or environmental disturbance, a veto can synchronize plants. It's had some support in massed seeding systems, so natural systems. We also have some preliminary support in this coffee system. There was a big coffee leaf rust outbreak in Costa Rica in about 2012. It was pretty devastating. And in the region where I was working, so I mentioned that we had this data from the farm level data. This is year, and this is just each little graph here is a farm, and you can see that there's these kind of up downs at a farm level. And then this red line here is the rust outbreak. And afterwards, there's kind of a sense that it gets a little more up and down, a little more alternate bearing afterwards. And so we quantified this by looking at the pairwise correlations between each farm. So here's the matrix, each farm you can imagine as a kind of a cell, and then again over here. And so every box here, every dot is a pairwise correlation between a pair of these farms. And before the rust, some are correlated, some are not. But when we look at the data from after the rust outbreak, you can see a shift towards much darker blue, right, which is indicative of more synchrony between plants, a metric of pairwise synchrony. It increased about 2.5-fold actually after the rust. So this is very preliminary, right? But it kind of offers some initial support for this, and be really exciting to pursue further. And so in addition to what might happen in terms of synchronizing plants across a farm, I was also interested, okay, what happens to a farm that's already maybe in this alternate bearing pattern? So it's already kind of synchronous, and then a shock occurs. So in a projected low year, no change regardless of whether the shock came pre or post depletion in this modeling scenario. It just stays on the same trajectory that it was on. If it hits in what was going to be a high year and before resources are invested in fruit load, so something that might disrupt floral, so like failed pollination or widespread fruit abortion, then we see that there's these kind of multiple bouts of consecutive low years. And there's this bumper crop in the middle. But again, if we're thinking about smallholder livelihoods, consecutive low years could be really quite devastating. and often a high year wouldn't kind of be able to make it stretch over the lows. If it occurs instead after depletion, so maybe a late frost or a pest outbreak like the coffee bearer borer that attacks the fruit, but researchers are still invested in them, then there's no effect on resource dynamics. It'll stay on the same kind of trajectory it was on, but it might result in these 3 consecutive years because resources have already been depleted, so it won't fruit again the following year. It's coming out of a low year. So this would result in a bout of kind of 3 consecutive low years. And so from the empirical data and also this theoretical modeling, they suggest that alternate bearing might play a much more central role to the resilience capacity in these perennial crop systems than has been appreciated or accounted for. And so I recently published this integrated framework, kind of making a case for the need to better integrate alternate bearing in socio-ecological resilience assessments. And so it's published as a perspective piece in One Earth journal to kind of motivate more research into the socio-ecological dimensions of alternate bearing. And we highlighted some priority areas for future research as well. So looking at interactions between farm level synchrony and farmers, what farm level strategies might be biologically feasible and economically or socially viable. What can other institutions do to better support farmers, and how does synchrony scale up among farms, even in regional and national levels? So some of the questions that we pointed to were to encourage kind of further inquiry were, are there features of crops or landscapes that make them more susceptible to synchrony? Do quantity quality trade-offs apply in low yielding years of the alternate bearing cycle? Right? And if so, might farmers be able to kind of monopolize or take advantage of higher quality in the low years to recover some of those losses? How often is alternate bearing synchronous at different spatial scales? And does it influence pest or pollinator dynamics? And so some of my current work is diving into a few of these. And so just a summary of kind of what we've established. It's really working towards a novel understanding of alternate bearing that explicitly links these plant dynamics to and grounds them in farmer experiences and socio-ecological resilience. So we've established the importance in these national scale data. We've started to tease apart some of the plant level mechanisms in terms of resource depletion. We've highlighted some of the feedbacks with farmer decision making and impacts on farmer livelihoods. And we've integrated that and synthesized that into a framework to better encourage further inquiry into this. And some of the work that we're doing now is looking at these cross-scale patterns of synchrony within coffee. So we were able to get this data set. It's the historical crop yields for 125 coffee growing districts, 25-year data set across different growing regions of Costa Rica. We're eliminating Zona Norte because it's less than 1% of contribution to national yields. Los Santos here is the big hitter. This is where I did my work in Tarazu. And so we're starting to look at kind of what signals, if any, are apparent at the different spatial scales and whether that is predicted by elevation or maybe total production. And we're again getting at this question of whether synchrony maybe shifted after the rust outbreak at a more national level. And then we're diving into, again, pairwise synchrony among districts and seeing whether things like geographic distance between them helps explain synchrony or a few other metrics as well. Outside of coffee, also thinking about this in blueberry, which is a more local system to Boston, where I'm working. It's also interesting because blueberry has only been cultivated for the past 100 years or so. Before that, it was really wild harvested. It's also native and local to the Boston area, right, to the Northeast. And so we're able to do this by comparison between cultivated crop settings and wild blueberry. So that's been really interesting to start to tease apart how whether alternate bearing is a consequence or perhaps exacerbated by our agricultural systems that really prioritize high yielding production, or if it's more inherent and apparent even in the wild and uncultivated settings. I'm also interested this year, starting to think about getting at the pollination component, right? And whether pollen supplementation might exacerbate patterns of alternate bearing, if there's more investment in fruit load, or if excluding pollinators might limit investment, result in higher fruit loads the next year. So we're just starting to kind of think about for this field season some plans to get at that angle as well. And then just today I submitted a grant application that was situating, again, this is one, I talked about it a lot today, but it's just one of the things that we're doing in the lab. And so situating it within a broader context of agroforestry crop yield. So in coffee agroforestry systems, how do shifting precipitation patterns like hurricanes and drought, right? This is work now in Puerto Rico that I'm proposing, influence crop yields, but also broader population and community responses to these contrasting stressors. And how do these interacting and contrasting sources of variability, both intrinsic and these differing drought and hurricane, influence farmer risk perceptions and adaptive strategies, and trying to get at participatory modeling of some of the enabling conditions, constraints, and synergies and trade-offs among those strategies. And I just want to conclude by kind of reminding the overarching aim of this work is to support resilient and multifunctional agroecosystems for people and planet. And so whether through our research or outreach or consumer choices or votes, right, there's a role that each of us can play in supporting a more resilient food system that preserves biodiversity and secures farmer livelihoods. Many thanks to lots of collaborators and mentors throughout this project, including Dr. Colin Oriens and Laura Kuhl, Elizabeth Crone, Tamara Tickton, and Randall Hughes, all the farmer participants and undergraduate and graduate research assistants, and funding from different agencies. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions about this work or any other work, or just research and life in general. So thanks so much.